class, it's Dr. Miller. We are in week 6 of our 9-week course. We are really trucking along as we look at the Pentateuch, the story of the first 5 books of the Bible, where they came from, how they were written, what they contain, what they mean for us. That's what we've been trucking along through, and so today we come to the 5th book of the Bible. We come to the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy means second law. Deutero means second, and nomos was the Greek word for law. And Deuteronomy is a second law because it is a summary of the laws that have been given to the Israelites just before they enter into the promised land. They've ventured out of Egypt. They've wandered through the wilderness. Moses has gone up to Mount Sinai to receive the 10 Commandments, come back down again. They've wandered towards the promised land. They were a little intimidated when they first got there, and so they had to wander for another 40 years in the desert before they could enter in. There's a sort of a profound statement that the older generation passes away in the desert so the new generation can enter in. The generation that actually remembers Egypt has to pass away. So a new generation can come in with a new faith, a new law, new leadership, and enter in and possess the land. So this is a series of speeches that Moses makes before they go into the promised land. They're standing on the other side of the river Jordan saying, hey, over there's the land we're going to inherit. We're going to have to fight and take it, but here's who we are. Before we go in, this is our vision statement. You can imagine a coach giving a speech to a team before they go out and play a championship game. This is who we are. This is where we come from. This is what we're about. Except Moses is saying, here are the laws that identify who we are. We got the laws from God, and this is our relationship with God, and this is the covenant that God has made with us. And the heart of the covenant with God is that God is a good God who has saved us. He's given us his laws. If we obey them in this new land, we'll be blessed. If we disobey them, we'll be punished. So we need to be faithful to God. And here are the laws again. And it's a summary of a lot of the laws that have already been offered, and it's some new ones as well. So that's what we're going to look at today, the book of Deuteronomy. But before we get to today's lecture, I want to I want to share with you my God sighting of the week. My God sighting this week is a fun one. I've told you a little bit about my church. I'm the pastor of Real Life Church, and we were formed 5 years ago, sort of by surprise, sort of without planning, unexpectedly. We met and had a Bible study in a park one day, and somebody stood up and announced that we were going to be a church before we had actually decided that's what we were doing, and so we started fairly quickly and spontaneously. From the very first days, we've seen God provide for us in ways that were supernatural. So in one of the very first weeks that we were together, I sat down with one of my board members for lunch on a Sunday afternoon after church. And he said, we're going to need some projectors so that we can project song lyrics up on the wall so we can all sing together. And that was at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon that same day, I got a text from a woman that I had not talked to in a long time and who I didn't know all that well. And she texted me and she said, God told me to give you my projector. And I want to meet you this week and give you my projector. And she did. We met for coffee and she gave me her projector. She said, I just know God wants me to give it to you. And we've been using that projector in our ministry since, to this day. 5 years later, we're still using it. And God has been providing in that way since the very beginning. We were coming to the end of our rental agreement with a school that we were using. We rented it for 3 years, and we were coming up on the 3-year timeline, and we didn't know where we were going to go next. We didn't have a place to go. And so a friend of mine and I went driving around one day, looking at properties, and the ones we looked at just weren't the right ones. And so we literally just started driving around. I mean, we didn't know where we were going. And we drove past a church, and he said, hey, there's a note in the window. Pull over. Let's go see what it says. So we pulled over, went to see what the note said, And the note said, please join us at one of our other locations. And I could hear the smoke alarm chirping inside because no one had changed the batteries in the smoke alarm for a long time. And I realized it was an empty church. And then I looked at the sign in front of the building, and I thought, I think I've heard the name of this church before. In fact, I think a friend of mine who used to be a pastor and who was a very close friend and mentor of mine, I think he said he had a church over in this area somewhere, and I think maybe this is his church. And so I took a picture of the sign and I texted it to his daughter on the East Coast, and I said, is this your dad's church? Because it's empty. And she said, yeah, I just got goosebumps. That was the church Dad was at back in the 1970s, and he pastored that church a long time ago. Let me put you in touch with the owners of the church and see if it's available. And that was in January of 2019. And in April of 2019, for Easter, we moved into the building and began to worship there. And so that came about by surprise. We didn't even know it was there. We just drove up one day and there it was. So that was another surprise miracle that just sort of dropped into our laps. Then last year during the pandemic, a church in Glendora called us and said, hey, we can't survive anymore as a church, but we have a preschool that's been very popular in the area. If we give you our building, will you keep the preschool going? And we said, sure, we'll do that. And so they had been in the process since January of 2021 of handing everything over to us. We've taken over the preschool. We've hired teachers. We're running everything. And just this last week, they finally signed over the title documents, and the property is now ours. And that's my God sighting for the week, because it's such a miracle. We went from meeting in a park 5 years ago to owning a property today that was just handed to us, and it was just a remarkable surprise, and one we didn't plan for, and one that God just handed us. So that's my God sighting of the week. I'd encourage you, if you've never tried praying before, if this is all new to you, try talking to Jesus about your life and about who you are and about what you're looking for in life, and go through that process of beginning to surrender your life to Him and seeing if He doesn't do better things with your life than you can do on your own. In my experience, He always can. And so I'm thankful for God and for what He's doing in my life today. That's my God sighting for the week. Let's get into our studies for the day.
The book of Deuteronomy, the epic conclusion to the Torah, and spoiler alert, Moses is going to die. Now, in order to understand this book, we need to remember the story so far.
So Israel has escaped from slavery in Egypt. Then they spend 1 year at Mount Sinai.
This is where they made the covenant with God to obey all of these laws.
Then they wander around the desert for 40 years before they make it to the Jordan River, which is right across from the land God promised them. They're ready to go in. This is where the book of Deuteronomy begins.
And what this book is really is a speech. Moses gives these final words. It's like a pep talk to the new generation of Israel that's about to go into the land. And the speech, it's broken up into 3 large sections.
So Moses begins the first part of the speech with a somber tone because he's highlighting Israel's rebellion and resistance, which has been going on for the last 40 years.
And that sets up the rest of this opening section, which is Moses' challenge to this new generation to be different from their parents and to respond to God's grace with love and obedience. So he reminds them of the 10 Commandments, like the basics of the covenant, and then he gives them this very famous line.
Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength.
Now, in Jewish tradition, this is called the Shema, because the first Hebrew word in this line is Shema Yisrael. And this became a very important prayer in Judaism, said twice a day. And it emphasizes the Israelites' exclusive commitment to their God, the one true God who loved them and who rescued them from slavery.
Right, because they're about to go into a land where people are worshiping many other gods.
And Moses thinks that loyalty to the Lord, their God, is the only way to life. Now, notice these key words in the Shema, listen and love. You're going to find these words all over this opening section of the speech. The word listen in Hebrew means more than just let sound waves come into your ears. It includes the idea of responding to what you hear. So for Israel, this means responding to God's grace by obeying the laws of the covenant.
And then listen is always followed by love.
Yeah, so love is the true motivation for obeying the laws. Israel won't obey without love, and they don't truly love if they don't obey. So there's this tight connection between loving and listening that runs through the entire book. And so Moses tells them that if they do listen and love, they will fulfill their original calling as the family of Abraham, to show all of the nations the wisdom and justice of God, and so become a blessing to them.
The second big section in Deuteronomy is a large block of laws and commands.
And this is where the book gets its name. Deuteronomy means a second law. And it's because many of these laws we've heard before. In fact, in the first line of the book, we're told that Moses is here explaining or clarifying the laws. So he's repeating and expanding on the laws, making them relevant to this new generation.
There's laws about how Israel's to worship God, laws about their leadership structure, laws about social justice, and then some more laws about their worship.
Now, after all of the laws, Moses warns Israel of the consequences of their obedience or disobedience, or in his words, the blessing or the curse. If they listen and love, they will experience blessing and abundance in the land, and if they don't, there's going to be famine and plagues, and they'll be forced off their land into exile.
And that brings us to the final section of his speech.
Yeah, here Moses says, I set before you today life or death, blessing or curse. So choose life. But then things get really interesting, because after 40 years with these people, Moses knows they're not going to obey, and so he predicts their failure and even their future exile from the promised land. And he focuses on what he thinks is the true source of the problem, that they have hard and selfish hearts. It's as if Israel is incapable of truly loving God in a way that brings about obedience.
But this problem isn't unique to Israel.
Yeah, in fact, Moses, when he's using this language about blessing and curse, he's tying Israel's story all the way back to all humanity's story from Genesis 1 through 3.
So Adam and Eve, they were blessed by God just like Israel and given a choice to trust and obey God like Israel.
And then they rebelled and brought a curse on the land, like Moses knows Israel is going to do. And so these stories, they're about Israel's hard heart, but they're actually a window into the universal human condition.
But Moses doesn't give up hope entirely.
That's right. He says that somehow, on the other side of Israel's exile, God promises to transform their heart so that one day they truly can listen and love.
In the final chapters, Joshua is appointed as the new leader of Israel.
And then Moses takes the entire law code,
The one he just predicted Israel would break.
that's right, and he puts it into the Ark of the Covenant. And then Moses hikes up to the top of a mountain so he can see the promised land from afar, and then he dies. And that's how the Torah ends.
Which is a strange place to end a story. I mean, it's right there at the climax. Will they obey the laws and live faithfully in the land or not?
Well, the story does continue right into Joshua, the next book of the Bible, but this is the end of the Torah, and it's been ended here for a reason. The Torah is written for people who are either outside of the land or who are still waiting for the fulfillment of God's promise to bless the whole world. And so now, as each generation reads the Torah, they find themselves called to hope in what Moses hoped for, a new, transformed heart that one day can truly listen and love.
So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy can roughly be divided into 4 sections. They're long speeches by Moses. The first one is sort of an identifying of who they are. They've been wandering in the desert for 40 years, and this is now the statement of this is who we are, this is the laws that God has given us, this is our identity. It begins in Deuteronomy 5 with a recapitulation of the 10 Commandments, the heart of the Jewish law. But then it goes into a description of the laws more broadly. And there's some 620 commandments in the Pentateuch all told. One of the most quotable and memorized verses or passages in Deuteronomy comes from Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it's called the Shema. because Shema is the Hebrew word for to hear, and it begins with the word hear. Hear, O Israel. And this is in Deuteronomy chapter 6 at verse 4. It says, Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commandments that I give you today will be upon your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road and when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you, a land with large, flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Then when you eat and are satisfied, be careful that you do not forget the Lord who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So it's a memory. We came from slavery. Don't forget that's where we were. We were lost. We had nothing. We now have abundance. We have a land to call our own that we didn't earn. It's ours, and we didn't achieve it. It was given to us. So don't forget it came from God. Don't rest on your own laurels and assume that you're great. Don't become an empire that oppresses other people. Trust in the God who provided for you. And that's the Shema. And that's the heart of the first speech to the people of Israel by Moses. If I were going to draw an analogy here, it's a little bit akin to the founding of the United States when in 1776 they wrote the Declaration of Independence, and in 1780, I think 1789, they wrote the Constitution. And those documents sort of served a twofold purpose of saying, we're not property of Britain anymore, we are our own people, and here's our identity. Here are the laws that we're going to live by. Don't forget that we came from being controlled by an empire that taxed us and didn't let us vote. So here are the rules that we're going to live by. And the Constitution then sets out the freedoms that are to be given to citizens of the United States. It's taken the United States a couple hundred years to even remotely get that right as it concerns minorities and women, and we are still working on it as a nation. But the idea was, remember where we came from, we value freedom more than Britain would allow us to have. So let's stand on these principles and protect freedom for all. That's a little bit akin to what's going on in the Hebrew nation. We are a new people. Don't forget where we came from, but we are not where we came from. We're something different than that. Here are the laws that we will live by. And that's the first speech from Moses. The second speech in the book of Deuteronomy, again, fleshes out more laws that they've been given. And it says, these are the laws that your possession of the land depends on. So your ownership of the land rests on you being faithful to these commandments. So in other words, it's sort of like a rental agreement where you sign an agreement, a lease with the landlord, and the landlord says, here are the principles by which you could be evicted if you don't follow these rules. And so it sets out all the principles that a landlord might have for the property that the landlord owns. So don't smoke, you can't have pets, you have to pay your rent on time, all those kinds of things. Here are the things you must do. Your possession of the property depends on your obedience to these commandments. And so Deuteronomy, the second law, is setting out the principles by which the possession of the property is to be governed. And there is sort of the warning that if Israel is not faithful, if they break the laws, they can be removed from the land. And in that sense, it's their land, but they are renters as far as God is concerned, because God can take it away. It's not theirs to keep if they violate their commandments, because they're now living under the Mosaic covenant, in which the way the covenant works is, I will be your God, you will be my people, follow these laws. And if you break these laws, punishment will ensue. And this is sort of foreshadowing, because indeed, some 1,000 years later, they will lose the land and end up in slavery in Babylon, right? And they'll go through a second slavery, the exile into Babylon. And this is sort of foreshadowing of that. And this passage will weigh on the Israelites as they evaluate why they ended up in Babylon, because they weren't faithful to the law. The third major speech in Deuteronomy reassures the Israelites and tells them that if you come to the place where you are removed from the land, should that terrible thing ever happen, you can be restored through a process of repentance that then allows them to return back to the land that they once owned. And in that sense, this is sort of like an agreement in which a parent says to a child, you've done wrong, here's your punishment, but if you do these things, you can be restored. You have to go to your room, you have to apologize to your sister for being mean to her, but if you do these things, then you can come out and play again. And that's a lighthearted analogy for what this third speech is about. The fourth and final speech in the book of Deuteronomy, which is right at the end, which contains Moses' final song and Moses' final blessing, and talks about Joshua taking the role of leadership, and then the death of Moses is just sort of the final conclusion of Deuteronomy. The fact that the death of Moses is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy sort of puts in an interesting light those who insist that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. I doubt very much that he wrote the story of his own death. And people who have just militantly defended Moses' authorship of the entire Pentateuch need to lighten up a little bit, because you can call them the books of Moses without requiring it to be the case that he dictated his own death before it happened. So anyway, that's how Deuteronomy concludes. But that's the outline of the book, and that's sort of the way to think of it in terms of analogies. The speeches are meant to identify their past, but separate them from their past, establish their identity, create a covenantal agreement by which if they obey it, they remain in the land. If they break it, they're out, but they can be restored should they actually lose possession of the land. And that's what Deuteronomy is all about.
The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name, from a Greek word deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are two outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into two parts themselves. Let's just dive in and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses, first of all, summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the 10 Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says, how? Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation: the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So, for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors, and it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so, two, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law, and you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9, and he quotes a law from Deuteronomy, chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses says this. He says, "I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile." Which is kind of a downer. But then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile, at any point, Moses says they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then of blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.
law and the Jewish faith, which was a faith of the law, God reveals the law to the Israelites. The covenant is that if they obey the law, God will bless them. If they disobey the law, God will punish them. This creates an environment, an atmosphere that factors into the life of Jesus. What happened is that the Israelites, over the course of hundreds and hundreds of years, would sometimes be faithful to the law, and then they'd fail to follow it. So they'd have to go to the temple and offer sacrifices. And then they'd try to be faithful again for a while. But again, they'd fail. And they'd have to go to the temple and offer sacrifices. And this happened over and over and over again. Well, in the season about 500 years before Jesus, the Jewish people ended up in slavery in Babylon. And they said this is because they had not been faithful to God. They had not obeyed God's laws, and so God let their kingdom fall apart. And so they ended up in Babylon at risk of losing their identity, of losing their culture, of losing their heritage. And in the Babylonian captivity, there arose a group of people who chose to stay separate from the Babylonian culture. In fact, they were called the set-apart ones, which in Hebrew is perushim. In the Gospels, they're called the Pharisees. And the set-apart ones said, let's not blend into the Babylonian culture. Let's not eat their food. Let's not celebrate their holidays. Let's not worship their gods. If you read the book of Daniel, you can see Daniel was very adamant about the fact he was going to pray to his God, even when the king of Babylon said it was illegal. And he was not going to eat the Babylonian food when he wanted to be faithful to his God. They decided they'd be separate from the Babylonian culture in order to preserve their own culture. They would keep speaking Hebrew. They would practice the Hebrew religion and traditions and holidays. They'd keep the Sabbath day and not work on the Sabbath. They do whatever it took to preserve their identity as a people. It kind of reminds me of something I saw one time with a family who belonged to a church at which I worked. The family was from an Asian country and had immigrated over to the United States. And although they lived here in the United States, they were really desperate to preserve their tradition and culture. One day I was sitting in the living room with the father of this family, and their teenage daughter came downstairs. This was a very conservative family from a very conservative culture. The teenage daughter came downstairs wearing clothes that you'd probably see American teenagers wear, but that were a little too revealing for people from this very conservative culture. Immediately, the father burst into the language of their home country. He was speaking to her, and it wasn't in English, so I couldn't understand the words. But based on his tone, I knew exactly what he was telling her. He sent her back upstairs to put on something else because she wasn't going out dressed like that. What he's doing is trying to say, hey, we're still a family. We still have a culture and a history and a legacy. We're not just going to blend in wherever we go. We're not going to absorb the values of the culture in which we live. We're going to preserve the culture of our family. You'll see families in the United States try to preserve their original language or preserve their original holidays or teach their kids to value the place from which they come in the hopes that their kids don't forget. Well, that was the Jewish people in Babylon. Don't forget where you came from. Don't forget who you are. When they returned back to Israel, because Cyrus, the king of Persia, defeated Babylon and let all the slaves go home. When they returned home, they said, let's never again make the mistakes that we made before. Let's not marry people from other cultures because that might make us worship their gods. Let's stay totally separate. 500 years later, by the time Jesus walks the earth, this group, the Pharisees, the set-apart ones, really control a lot of the Jewish culture. They've preserved the Jewish identity. They've fought against change, and they've fought against watering down their identity. If you're a Jewish person living in the first century, you respect the Pharisees because they have kept the culture together. But you also fear the Pharisees because they're the ones who decides who's in and who's out. If you offend the Pharisees, they can essentially blackball you from the culture. And so the people are respectful of the Pharisees, but they're also terrified. The Pharisees are the people that Jesus ends up in arguments with almost every day. Jesus' daily calendar is work a miracle, fight with a Pharisee. Work a miracle, fight with a Pharisee. And that's because Jesus wanted to restore to the people a remembrance that God loves them and wants to bless them. The laws were for their health and for their good, not to punish them or to make one group self-righteous and the other group meek. So Jesus associates with the outcasts, with tax collectors and prostitutes, with Samaritans and adulterers. And he ends up in conflict with the righteous religious people, the keepers of the temple and the teachers of the law. Jesus isn't interested in staying separate from broken and lost people because Jesus sees every single person out there as a lost child of God. Jesus longs to reconcile to us and to call us back into a relationship with God our Father. I remember some years ago going through the mail and throwing items of the mail away in the trash can. I figured out that if I got to the mailbox before my family did, I could throw away all the catalogs and mailers and save myself a lot of money. So I'd stand over the trash and go through the trash can and throw away the junk mail. One of the things I found in this junk mail was a piece of paper. It was just printed black and white and bulk mailed out, so I threw it away, and it fluttered down to the bottom of the trash can. I looked down and I saw it, and on this trash can on this piece of trash were a couple of pictures of children. And next to them were the words, "Have you seen me?" And I realized this was one of those mailers probably put together by some parent seeking a child who was lost, maybe kidnapped or disappeared. And I looked down in that trash can at those two kids' pictures looking up at me. And I realized, if those were my kids, I would go to the ends of the earth to find them. I would quit my job and spend every single day asking everyone I could find, "Have you seen this child? Have you seen this child? Have you seen this child?" I would never give up. Well, that's how God feels about you. That's how God feels about all of us. We are God's lost children. And he's not interested in being a keeper of the law who's seeking to punish us. He's not a school vice principal or a police officer. He loves us. He is a father of runaway children who wants to come and save us and take us home. In Jesus' day, there are the keepers of the law who study Deuteronomy and have it memorized, and who use that law to club other people over the head. Jesus was not interested in law for the law's sake. Jesus was only interested in law so much as it blessed people to healthy and good life. And that's who Jesus was. Now, there's one question that often comes up in Christian theology, and it's tied a bit to the book of Deuteronomy. And the question is, how can any religion say that it's the right one, or that they know which of the religions points towards the God who is really there? Deuteronomy has all kinds of laws about not associating with the Canaanites and not worshiping their gods, and it even calls the Israelites to destroy the idols dedicated to foreign gods. If you look at the Ten Commandments begins, "You shall have no other, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me, you shall not make any idols." And there's a sense of exclusivity to the Judeo-Christian God. This is the one, the other ones are false. And so there's a question that arises, especially in this modern day, where we're very aware of different religions, and even among different religions, there are different denominations, different sects, different break-off groups. How could any one group claim to be right or wrong? And it's a good and fair question. And you can err in two directions here. You can err in the direction of being so exclusive, you refuse to listen to anyone who thinks about the world differently than you, or you can be so open-minded that there's nothing that's out of bounds, and you'll find that that's a mistake as well. Here's how I think about this. Imagine there is a God who created the universe, and he started everything off, and he put the world in motion, and he's interacted with the world in certain ways, whether appearing as Jesus of Nazareth and walking the earth, or revealing laws to Moses, whatever it is. Well, it's not at all a stretch of the imagination to suggest that people could come along and fabricate religious ideas. That someone who wants money and power could just make up religious claims that aren't true and could do so intentionally, could intentionally deceive people to claim that certain religious things are true, which actually are not. Obviously, that has happened in history. It'd be ridiculous to say it didn't. It's happened over and over again. And it's happened in some major ways. And so to simply say all religions are the same is to exclude the possibility that someone could make up lies in the name of religion. And we know people make up lies in the name of religion. People have done it throughout history. People have gone to prison for running scams through religious organizations. So when you look at the world's major religions and you're inclined to say, well, they're all just the same, you have to look at one very important point. If two world religions contradict each other, say things that are mutually exclusive, they can't both be right. So for instance, Christianity says that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead. And those events are the central events in all of history. Those are the most important things that have ever happened. The cross is that intersection at which all of history changes direction. And if you believe that Jesus died on the cross for you, you're forgiven. And if you don't believe that Jesus died on the cross for you, then when you stand in front of God, you're still guilty of everything you've ever done wrong. You're not forgiven. So for Christianity, that is the central event. You can't get away from it or around it. God is the one who walked the earth as Jesus of Nazareth, died on the cross for our sins, and rose from the dead. Now the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, says that Jesus did not die on the cross. It says that his disciples were confused and thought he died on the cross, but in fact it was somebody else. He never died on the cross. And of course, if he didn't die on the cross, he certainly didn't rise from the dead. In fact, the Quran teaches that Jesus isn't God either. Now, that's a disagreement on a fundamental issue. That's not a disagreement on how to do church or where to have a worship service or what moral issues are important to the church. That is a disagreement about who God is. And either Jesus was God or he was not both. And he either died on the cross to save humanity or he did not both. And that's not an inconsequential issue. It is the central issue for Christianity. So while you can say Christianity and Islam are both wrong, that's an option, you can't say they're both right. If one of them is right, the other one is necessarily wrong on the most fundamental issue Christians hold to. And so the claim that all religions are the same is actually naive. In fact, it's insulting. It's insulting to every religion because it says the particularities of any given religion just don't matter. The things that religion cares about just don't matter. The things that are most important and most precious to that religion just aren't important and can be washed away and blended with all the other religions. That's insulting to religious people. So the claim that all religions are the same is nonsense. We know that historically people have lied in the name of religion in order to get power and money. And when two religions contradict each other, they can't both be right. One has to be wrong. Now you can ask, where would a wrong religion come from? Does that mean that Muhammad just made everything up? That's certainly a possibility. There are other possibilities as well. We could say that the founder of a religion was confused and thought that he or she was telling the truth, but actually was deceived. But whichever way it falls, at the end of the day, it means that there are religious views with lots of adherents which are wrong. Another one which stands in contradiction to Christianity and can't be right alongside it is Mormonism. Mormons claim to be Christians, but the core doctrines of Mormonism contradict Christianity. Mormons say that if you die and you're faithful, then you go up to a planet of your own and you can populate it with a spiritual family. It in essence says that when you die, you can become a god. Christianity says that there's only one God, and any claim to be a god is a rejection of God. So they can't both be true. Now, I would say wholeheartedly, in the case of Islam, I think Muhammad knew that what he was saying wasn't true. I think he was fabricating a faith system in order to gain power and money and attention for himself, which it did. The Quran actually says that men can have 4 wives, except the Prophet Muhammad, who's allowed to have as many wives as he wants. And most of our historical accounts show that he had between 11 and 16 wives, one of whom was a 9-year-old girl. The idea that God revealed all this to Muhammad and set him free for a life of conquest, I don't think is that plausible. Furthermore, the claims that Muhammad makes that are about events that happened 600 years before him or 1,000 years before him that are different than the oldest accounts of those events make his claims less credible. I mean, imagine me making up stories about things that happened in the 1400s that contradict what the history books say, and just telling you, well, God told me that the history books are wrong and I'm right. You wouldn't have very good reason to believe that, and I don't think there's very good reason to believe that Muhammad's claims recorded in the Quran are true. When it comes to Mormonism and Joseph Smith, we know good and well Joseph Smith liked to fabricate things. His own mother said he liked to make up stories. His religion, again, allowed him multiple wives, and we know from the historical accounts, which have now been covered in major journals like the New York Times, Joseph Smith took as his wives some of his friends' wives. Joseph Smith went about pursuing power for himself and attention for himself, and in fact died in a prison riot at a time when he claimed to be running for president of the United States. Joseph Smith's life is a bit ridiculous, and the claims of Mormonism are science fiction. They're fabricated by Joseph Smith to draw attention to himself. Another big modern deception that's very popular but that's slowly being exposed is Scientology. There are all kinds of media outlets that are now covering the horrible experiences that members of Scientology have had. Scientology doesn't claim to be a religion exactly. It claims that it can be accommodated to any religion so that you could be a Christian or a Muslim or a Buddhist and also practice Scientology. But Scientology is widely considered a fraud. Scientology says that there were space aliens that landed on the Earth and that somehow they can be implanted in your skin, which can cause you stress. And you have to go through Scientology's program to relieve stress in order to be freed from them. Any reasonable person who reads the doctrines of Scientology can tell that they're obviously nonsense. And in fact, they were created by a science fiction author, L. Ron Hubbard, who a year before founding Scientology said, if you want to get rich, don't write science fiction, start a religion. And that's exactly what he did. So while people think that they're being kind or gracious by saying all religions are the same and you can't say one is right and others are wrong, they're actually being deceived and deceptive. They're making themselves vulnerable to all kinds of nonsense and lies and encouraging other people to do the same. Somehow saying that that's the gracious way to view the world is an ugly thing to do to people. A wiser way to approach it would be to say, look, in this life, there are liars, and people will lie to you for all kinds of reasons to get what they want for themselves, and they'll use God to endorse their lies. So when someone preaches to you a religious doctrine, no matter what it is, don't take it at face value. Ask questions about it, doubt it, think about it, critically analyze it, talk to other people about it, read about it. Don't just accept religious doctrines that are given to you. You never know who's trying to deceive you or take something from you. And so you have to take all those things with a critical eye. I say that speaking as a Christian. And that means I've approached Christianity critically, doubtfully, skeptically, and I've poked at it and prodded it, discussed it with other people, debated it, wondered about it. At one point I rejected it and ran away from it. And now I can tell you I have every reason to believe that Christianity is true. That it actually reveals that God who created the universe and set everything up in the beginning, and who in the fullness of time came down to the earth as Jesus of Nazareth and walked among us. There are all kinds of reasons I have for defending why I think Christianity is actually the truth, which we won't get into today. But that is to answer the question that people often ask about Christianity or about the Judeo-Christian faith, especially when it comes to books like Deuteronomy that says, don't worship the Canaanite gods, in fact, tear down their statues. The reason is because there are fabricated religions out there. There are religions that are not true, that somewhere along the way someone made up. And it's better to know the truth than to live deceived just because you think it's going to be nice to people. Now, there's one question that often comes up for Christians as it concerns the study of the Old Testament law. And the question is, what has this got to do with us? The Jewish law is filled with commandments that we no longer follow, like commandments not to eat pork and all kinds of washing rituals and ceremonial rituals, which just aren't a part of our culture or our world anymore. So what do they have to do with us? And as pertains to the moral laws in the Hebrew scriptures, are we bound to those in the same way as we're bound to the teachings of the New Testament? And how do you discern what's what? Well, when you think about the law in terms of the big picture, God's law, and how God's law relates to Christians, you have to remember, first of all, according to the teachings of the New Testament, Christians are free from the law. This is a point that Paul is at pains to make in his letter to the Galatians. He says, "It is for freedom that Christ has set us free. Don't then return again to slavery." And the slavery that he is talking about is slavery to the law, obedience to God's maxims so as to prove oneself worthy of God. He says it's never going to work anyway. Everybody is sinful. Everybody's broken. You're never going to be able to sufficiently follow the law in order to please God, so stop trying. His analogy in Galatians is a nursemaid or a tutor is put in charge of a child to bring up a child in the house. In the ancient Greco-Roman world, it was not uncommon for wealthy families to hire a caregiver for children called a pedagogos. And the pedagogos, from which we get the word pedagogy, or teaching, right? Pedagogos was a tutor who had full responsibility for the child, even inclusive of discipline of the child, in order to make sure the child grew up healthy and safe. But when the child became an adult, the pedagogos' job was done, and the adult now became an heir to the estate, would inherit what the parents had to pass on. And Paul says that's what the law did. The law is your pedagogos, it's your tutor, your nursemaid, your caregiver that brings you up in order to lead you to Christ. And then once you belong to Christ, the law's job is done. So Paul really does have the sense that we are not bound by the law. So then, when we read the Ten Commandments, what are we supposed to do with those? It has some really good principles in there, like don't murder, don't commit adultery, don't steal, don't lie. What do we do with all of those? An interesting interpretation of the law that's been taught through Christian theology for the last 500 years or so came from a reformer of the 16th century, the 16th century, Martin Luther, who really was the catalyst for the Protestant Reformation. And Luther said the law has three purposes. Even for Christians, the law still has three uses. One, he says in his commentary on the Galatians, he says the law is a hammer to our self-righteousness. It destroys our sense of pride, or any sense we have that we can be good enough for God, that when we stand in front of God, we can say, well, I was a pretty good person. He says, look at the law. The law ought to show you how far you have fallen short of that, how much you and I stand condemned by the law. We can never stand in front of a perfect God and say, I've been good enough. The law reveals that in us. So the law exists for our humility. Number one, it makes us humble. It shows us that we need something more than just good behavior because we cannot be good enough. Secondly, the law serves the purpose of constraining the evildoer. And Luther really felt like it was the job of the state to wield the sword, to govern discipline so as to rein in evil, to prevent theft and murder and conquest and all kinds of terrible behavior. And the law could use controlled violence to bring about peace in the state. And certainly we still believe that. All civilized nations have some system of government, which includes an executive branch, police and military, that enforce the law. And I have yet to see a nation say that because we are Christian, we're not going to have police and military. I have not seen a a nation even try that. And thirdly, the law serves the purpose of it humbles us, it constrains the evildoer, and then it gives us a model of what good behavior should look like. So we're no longer functioning as they did under the Mosaic covenant, with the sense that if I am sufficiently obedient to the law, I have been justified in God's eyes. Instead now, the law serves as sort of a modeling role. It gives us a system of principles by which we can discipline ourselves to good behavior. It no longer plays a role in our salvation. It only plays a condemnatory role. It only condemns us. It only shows us that we're broken in the process of salvation. But it can serve as a model for what good behavior looks like, how a reasonable, well-socialized person will behave. And so those are Luther's three principles of the law, the purposes of the law as it still exists in our world today. Paul will say you're not enslaved to the law. He'll say all things are permissible, but not all things are beneficial. So you should do what's good for you and others, even though you're not bound by the law anymore. And this is a fun way we celebrate this at our church. Every Father's Day in June at Real Life Church, we cook about 100 pounds of bacon. And we do that because people love bacon, first of all. We get people who come to church who've never been to church before because it smells like bacon. But there was a hot subject of debate in the first century world that came about because there were Jewish ceremonial laws that said we don't eat pork. And Jesus at one point had said, it's not what goes into your body that makes you unclean, it's what comes out of your body that makes you unclean. It's what you say, it's how you present yourself, it's what you do. You can eat anything you want to. And Paul then picks up that issue because a hot subject of debate in the first century world came about because there were temples dedicated to the Greek and Roman gods, to Zeus and Aphrodite and Apollo. And at the altars to these gods, people would offer food, among other things. And meat that had been offered to an idol would then be sold in the marketplace. This was the temple fundraiser, right? This was the church chili cook-off raffle tickets, right? You'd go take the meat that was offered, you'd sell it in the marketplace, and then the temple would have money. But if you bought meat that had been offered to Zeus, it was seen as a way of identifying with Zeus, of saying, I am a follower of Zeus, I am a believer in Zeus. And so the first century devout Jewish people would not buy meat that had been offered to an idol. And that was really a hot subject of debate. Today that's a foreign concept to us, but that was really a militant debate among religious people. And the Apostle Paul said, definitively, he said, I can eat whatever I want. That has nothing to do with my morality or my relationship with God. I can eat whatever I want. He said, I won't eat meat if it offends somebody else. My freedom is limited by courtesy. But I know that I am free. It has nothing to do with my salvation. And so, as far as we know, the Apostle Paul was one of the first Jewish people to say, hey, we can eat pork now. It's free game. And so we cook 100 pounds of bacon at our church on Father's Day. One, because I love bacon. Everybody loves bacon. And two, because it is a celebration of our identity in Christ. We are no longer bound by ceremonial religious laws. And for anybody who has been raised in a system of religion that was nothing but legalism, that was nothing but principles that controlled and constrained them, it's incredibly freeing to realize that in Jesus, this isn't about religion. This is about a relationship with the God who made you and who loves you and who walked the earth so that you could know who he is. For those who have grown up thinking religion is just a bunch of rules to follow, that is as far from Christianity as hell is from heaven. That's not what Christianity is about. Christianity is about entering into a relationship with Jesus, who loves you and who died for you.